The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Great crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and addressed them. If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Which of you, wishing to construct a tower, would not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough for completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish the work, the onlookers should laugh at him and say, "This one began to build, but did not have the resources to finish." Or what king, marching into battle, would not first sit down to decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops? But if not, while he is still far away, he will send a delegation to ask for peace terms. In the same way, any one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Man, what's bugging Jesus today? Ever since June 5th, when we completed the Easter season and all the other feasts that go with Easter, from then through the late spring all the way through the summer, we have in Luke's Gospel been traveling with Jesus to Jerusalem and hearing every week as he teaches and demonstrates to people, to the great crowd following him, what it means and what it is like to be a disciple. And today, in essence, he turns to the crowd and says, "Can you do it? Can you do it? Are you up to being a disciple?" The point of the gospel isn't so much the little parable about building a tower and calculating that out, or going to battle and figuring out if you can win or not. Those serve as an example to say, when you undertake a major project, you think about it. You look at your resources, try to decide if you can see this thing through, because anything worth having has a price attached to it. And the same is true of discipleship. If you're going to call yourself a disciple, if you want to put that mantle on, can you see it through? Are you ready to undertake what that means to be a disciple? This gospel hopefully bothers you at some level. I think it's one of those gospels that you don't drift away on when you're hearing it proclaimed, because the wording is so dramatic and so powerful. It should disturb you somehow. Jesus calling you to hate your mother and your father, your wife, your children, your brother, your sisters, your husband. Wait a minute. Isn't this the guy who taught us to love our enemies and to love our neighbors ourselves? And what about that fourth commandment, to honor mother and father? And to renounce all your possessions, like everything? I mean, we know from the scriptures that Jesus, or at least his group of close friends, they had a money bag that supported them as they did things, and that he had wealthy female supporters and people who helped take care of him in his ministry, and he's not dumping everything. I mean, can you imagine for a moment Jesus hating his mother? Of course not. Of course not. We know that he cared very much for her. Even as he hung dying on the cross, he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. "John, there's your mother." He cared very much for her. So we have to be careful, because if we take this gospel in a literal and fundamental way, we will go places Jesus himself never went. And Jesus never calls us to do what he didn't himself do. So there must be something else going on here. There must be. With this kind of gospel, it's always helpful to have a little bit of context. And here's what's going on. You may remember last weekend, Jesus had been invited to a dinner by a leading Pharisee. And he took that opportunity to give the teaching about when you go to a dinner, take the last place, not the first place. And when you throw a dinner yourself, invite those who can't repay you back. Well, between the end of that gospel and today's gospel, there's 9 verses that we have not heard here in the church. And in those 9 verses, Jesus tells a parable about a king who gives a wedding feast. And he invites people to come. And the people invited make excuses for not responding to the invitation. One says, I just got married, I got to go be with my wife. Another says, I've got a farm, I bought some ox, I've got a business, so you'll have to excuse me. So people refuse the invitation of the king because of other people and because of their possessions. And finishing that parable, Jesus turns to the great crowd following him and sort of pulls out the punchline, pulls out the meaning in a very dramatic fashion and says, so, unless you hate other people and renounce all your possessions, you're not going to answer the invitation. You're not going to come to the wedding feast. You're not going to be a disciple. It's a very Jewish sort of form of hyperbole and over-exaggeration to drive a point home. Jesus doesn't call us to renounce just for the sake of renouncing and to hate just for the sake of hating, but he is very much aware that our devotion, our dedication to other people and to other things can take priority over his invitation and God's call in our life. And that's what he's driving home. That when there's that invitation, when there's that call to be a disciple, if you're going to answer it, then it gets the priority over everything in life. That call from God, that invitation from Christ, relativizes everything else in life. See, the problem is that so much in our life relativizes the call of God, puts God's call somewhere down the list. I mean, you can probably begin to think of things just in your own life, in my own life, that make you go, I can get to God later. You know, there's this, that, other thing happening on Sunday morning, so I'll skip church this week. I'm so busy, I've got so much to do today, I have no time for prayer today, or tomorrow, or this week, or this month, or this year. I'm just exhausted, so I don't have the time or the energy to perform any corporal or spiritual work of mercy. There's all kinds of things in our life that happen that bump God. And Jesus is saying, no. If you're going to be a disciple, God should bump all of that. God should bump all of that. It relativizes all those things. And it's not that loving people is really a problem, except that it can become a problem when our understanding of ourselves comes so fully from them and our worrying so much about what other people think about us that it hinders us from hearing or responding to God's call. What will people think if I do that? Having possessions is not a problem. We all have them. Jesus had them. The problem becomes when our taste for them, our need for them, is inexhaustible. And our life and our focus becomes all about getting stuff. All those things that can put God's call in our life to the side. And Jesus is saying to the great crowd following him, if you want to be a disciple, you have to realize that cannot be the case. That cannot be the case. It's very interesting because there's this huge crowd, right? But so very few of them become disciples. So very few of them. I find that very challenging. And I think we're very fortunate that on this day, this very day, we have a great example of what it is to sort of move from being a believer to actually being a disciple. To having your life so closely identified with Christ's call in your life that that's what you're known for. Being a disciple. And that example is, of course, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. As you're probably aware, as we all slept last night in Rome, she was canonized as the latest saint of the church. We have a new saint today, St. Teresa of Calcutta. Yay, yeah, let's have a party. Absolutely. Someone bake a cake. Definitely. But as I wrote about in the bulletin, she wasn't always Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I find her story challenging in this way. Before becoming Mother Teresa of Calcutta, she was a nun. She belonged to a religious order, and her name was Sister Agnes. And for 20 years, Sister Agnes taught in schools and taught children. She was part of her community. She was a woman of prayer. She was a woman of faith. She was a woman faithful to the church. But one day in September of 1945, while traveling on a train from Calcutta to Darjeeling, she experienced what she called a call within a call. That she suddenly had this sense that God wanted her to do something more than she was already doing. That God wanted her to live among the poorest of the poor and to care for them. Okay. And obviously she did that. But if you think about it, probably any of us would look at her life as Sister Agnes and say, "Oh, sister, you've been a faithful nun for more than 20 years now. You're doing good work. You're educating children in India, and that's desperately needed. You've got a commitment to community, and you're a woman of prayer. You don't have to step it up. You're doing better than most of us." And she herself could have certainly said, "Oh, my goodness, well, that's a nice idea, but, I've got responsibilities in my life. I've got responsibilities to the kids. I've got responsibility to my community. I've given up a lot already. I'm doing okay." She certainly could have done that and lived a holy life. But she never would have become the powerful witness to Christianity that she did in the 20th century. And chances are, Sister Agnes would have not been canonized last night. She took it from being a believer to being a disciple. You can say that about any of the disciples: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Andrew. I'm sure they all could have been wonderful men with marvelous families, having religious experiences, attending synagogue every week, being people of prayer, and would have done fine. But they would have remained part of the crowd. They never would have been known as disciples. Never had their life so closely identified with Jesus that that's how they're known in the world. They never would have had that. When that invitation to discipleship comes, well, today, essentially, Jesus says to the crowd, can you do it? He gives us a chance to step back and reflect upon what it is he's asking of us. You've got to give this to Jesus. He never sugarcoats what it costs to follow him. You're not going to slide into being a disciple. It has to be a decision. Now, while I may not be using words like hate your mother and father, you have to realize the call is no less challenging, because we, my brothers and sisters, all the time give everything else in the world a priority. People we fall in love with, things that we desire to have, usually sort of an unexpected emotional reaction to something, and we go for it. It becomes the center of what we're doing. That's not what Jesus is looking for. He's looking for you to make the choice, yes, I'm going to put him first. That your life will be so closely identified with him that you'd be known as a disciple. I've talked with you before about the Lutheran pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote the book, The Cost of Discipleship. And he's aware that there's a whole lot of people who are in the crowd. They hang out in church because it's a nice place to be. People are good, and we're believers, and we want to do well. But he says there are a whole lot of people of faith who want what he calls cheap grace. Cheap grace. And by that he means forgiveness without really being repentant or changing our lives. Baptism without living the life of the church. Communion without really believing. To be a disciple without the cross. In other words, they want to be a Christian without Jesus Christ. They want to be Christian without Jesus Christ. Not all who follow are disciples, but to all who follow is given the invitation, the opportunity, the challenge to enter into the adventure of being a disciple. And just to back it up, don't worry. Those who you do love should not fear at all if you put love of God and His call in your life first. If you truly love God, then you will follow the fourth commandment. You will honor father and mother. If you truly love God, then your spouse will never have to worry about you being unfaithful or not being there. If you love God, then no child will have to worry about neglect or abuse or abandonment. When you truly love God, all the other relationships of life, including that with things, fall into their proper and their holy place. Suddenly, it all clicks. Not all who follow are disciples, but to all who follow is given the invitation to become one.